Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. For those of you who are new to the Haberman Institute, I am Matthew Silverman, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our lecture tonight titled Diversity in Israeli Society in Light of the October 7th Massacre with Professor Amit Schejter. Unfortunately, the diversity of Israeli society is a subject that often gets neglected in contemporary conversations. I wonder how much our current climate would shift if people better understood the history, complexity, and diversity of Israeli society. My hope is that this program will help, even if in a small way, to educate and transform our world. With that in mind, please ask questions and share brief thoughts using the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Questions will primarily be discussed at the end of the lecture, and we will get to as many as possible. Thank you to Americans for Ben-Gurion University for partnering with us and helping bring this program to our communities. I look forward to working on many, many more programs together. Thank you also to Art and Edie Hessel for sponsoring this program and encouraging us to build a strong partnership between the Haberman Institute and Americans for Ben-Gurion University. And with that, I now welcome Art, the Haberman Institute Board Vice President and former board member of Americans for Ben-Gurion University, who will say a few words and introduce our speaker. Welcome, Art.
Thanks, Matt, very much, and welcome everybody. As Matt said, I'm Art Hessel. I'm Vice President of Haberman, and we are here tonight to listen to Professor Schejter of Ben-Gurion University talk about the subject diversity in Israeli society in light of the October 7 massacre. For those of you who are new to Haberman, and there are many this evening, let me just say a little about the organization. It was founded here in Washington, D.C. over 40 years ago by Rabbi Joshua Haberman, and our mission is to provide quality educational programming, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, culture. We hope that you not only join us tonight in our last lecture for the year 2023, but for future lectures next year. Our next program will be featuring Rabbi Arnold Resnikoff speaking about Jewish military chaplaincy in War and Peace. That'll be January 17. And then over the course of the winter, we have programs on the history of the Jewish community of Cincinnati, of the relationship between Richard Wagner's operas and Jews, Jewish influence on slavery in pre-Civil War Charleston, Jewish ethics and genetic enhancement, and believe it or not, we're having a program on Maurice Sendak. Plus, if you go to our website, you can look at our archives and you'll see over 200 previous Haberman programs. And I guarantee you'll find some that you're interested in. Tonight's topic is obviously a serious one. We are all torn apart by the conflict currently flaring between Israel and Hamas. And I'm very pleased tonight to introduce Professor Schejter to talk about how Israelis are reacting to and influencing the conflict. This evening's program is one of a series of programs, as Matt said, co-sponsored by the Haberman Institute and Americans for Ben-Gurion University. I spent 20 years on the American for Ben-Gurion University board and was the treasurer of that organization for 6 of those years. So I came to know Ben-Gurion University quite well. Its dramatic growth, its world-class research, its mission to serve the Negev and Israel and the broader world. You'll be getting a follow-up email from us in a day or two, and we will let you know in that email how you can help both Haberman and Americans for Ben-Gurion continue to fulfill their missions through your contributions. Both organizations depend on you. If you went today to BGU's campus situated in the northern Negev desert and only about 30 miles from the Gaza border, you would see a different institution from the one that I've seen so many times. No classes have been held yet this academic year. About a third of the university's students have been called up in the military and the reserves. There are dormitories being used to house families displaced by the war. Other buildings are being used to help those who have been wounded. And the BGU community has been affected in other ways. 84 students, faculty members, or staff, or their close family members have died. 5 have been kidnapped. Professor Schejter, I'm sure, will address this as part of his talk. So let's talk a little about him. He's born in Philadelphia, which is not in Israel. He's the professor of communication studies and the former dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Ben-Gurion University. He has degrees from the Hebrew University, from Boston University, and from Rutgers. He's written 8 books and many more articles. And in his spare time, he's chairman of the board of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. I was given a long, long biography of all of his awards and accomplishments, but then if I told you about those, we wouldn't have a chance to hear from him. And we are here to listen to him and not to hear about him. So with that, Professor Schejter, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Art, for this very generous introduction. I will share my screen with you now. And just, is it okay? Everybody can see it? So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this event. I've always found the medium of Zoom a very weird one to have conversations on, and I hope it will be successful and interesting. Originally, when we first talked about this meeting, we were going to discuss diversity in Israeli society, as comes up from my research of many years. But then the war broke out, the massacre occurred, and afterwards the war broke out, and decided to more frame it in the context of current events to make it more relevant to the audience. But just for the sake of the background, I mentioned, Art mentioned the books I've been involved in and writing about, that most of the background for the work that I'll be talking about comes from studies that I've done in the field of communications. I study the law of communications. I study how communication systems are structured. And for the past maybe 15 years, I've been mostly looking about how different marginalized and diverse communities in Israel use communications. And it is through this way that they use communications, how much communications they have, what type of technologies they use, how they adapt them, that I've created this talk that describes Israeli society and its diversity from a different angle, I think, than you usually get to talk about. I'm presenting these books. I'm not expecting you to buy them. They're all in academic presses and they cost tons of money. But I'm sure you can find them online at some local library. So I think that one of the things that I think Art mentioned in his introduction as well, and Matt did, is that people tend to overlook the fact that Israel is a very, very diverse society. I've noticed this especially recently regarding the conversations I've had and events that I've seen that have to do with the current conflict, current violent conflict in the region. There seems to be this view that Israel is a monolithic society from different aspects, ethnically, culturally, religiously, and so forth. And it overlooks the fact that, in fact, Israel is an extremely diverse society. About 30 years ago, the Israeli sociologist Sami Smuha put about what he called the 5 cleavages of Israeli society. And he talked about 5 aspects where Israeli society is split, the way he saw them at that time. One is the political, that between the right and the left, we would say between the more dovish and more hawkish when it comes to relations with the Arab world and with the neighboring countries. The other is the national, which of course is the actual conflict with the Arab countries, with the neighboring countries, most of which Israel today is actually has peaceful relations with. Another cleavage or fracture in society is the one around religion. It seems again from afar that all Jews are alike. I assume that many of the participants or listeners tonight are Jewish and know that Judaism is a very, very diverse entity, a very diverse religion, and very diverse group of people. And that is reflected in Israeli society as well. When Smucha talks about the ethnic diversity, he talks about ethnicity within and among the Jewish people, especially the rift between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi. But in those years when he wrote, for example, was right before or right around the large influx of immigration from the former Soviet Union, which made Israeli ethnicity even more diverse, and the probably the large, much smaller though quite large immigration from Ethiopia, which also contributed to that diversity. And there's, of course, economic diversity. Israel, as we will discuss later, has rich and has poor like every other country. But there's many more fractures in Israeli society beyond what Professor Smuha wrote 30 years ago. He overlooked the fact that we have questions of diversity and of fractures along gender lines. We've had issues like every other Western society regarding the acceptance of sexual orientation diversity. There's all kinds, there's questions that have to do with diversity that is within these different categories. So we could have diversity that is different or differences between women in the different categories or between rich and poor within the different categories. And about 10, 12 years ago, we had what I will refer to later as the rise of the new middle class in Israel, which was something that was not known and not referred to beforehand. So Israel is a very fractured and diverse society, and I will focus tonight on only 3 of these. I will talk quite a bit about the national diversity within Israeli society, because that, of course, is at the background of the current conflict. I will talk about religion, and I will talk about gender, and then very briefly about some other aspects of Israeli society. So let's dive into the numbers and the explanations and the descriptions. Okay. So when we talk about the national rift, okay, I want to take a very, very brief history of how we've reached where we are. Because when you talk about Jews, especially in the American context, people think of the Jewish people as a religious people. But in the late 19th century, Judaism went through a transformation. Alongside the spring of nations and the rise of nationality in Europe, Jews also started seeing themselves as a national entity and not only as a religious entity, which was the basis for the forming of Zionism. I found lately when I visit different universities across the states, and when I mention Zionism and I say that Zionism means the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, people don't understand that that's the origin of what this is. Today, the term Zionism has got mixed with so many other things that are unrelated to it. But the meaning of Zionism is that Jews sees themselves as a people, not only as a religion. And the result of that was the massive immigration of Jews moving out of Europe and out of Northern Africa and other Middle Eastern countries mostly, to what at the time, in the beginning, was the British colony of Palestine, even though this movement already started during the colonial rule of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th and early 20th century. Alongside the formation of Jews as a nation, rather than as a religious group only, was the formation of the Palestinians as a nation. We can pinpoint specifically to the connection between the Arabs residing within the land that is between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and between nationalism to around 1920, for the third National Palestinian Council meeting. So just as much as the idea of Judaism being, or Jews being a nation, not only a religion, alongside came the idea that the Palestinians, who mostly saw themselves until then as members of the Arab nation, starting to identify themselves as a nation as well. And this naturally led to a conflict. Jews were coming in different numbers into the area. This led to the conflict, led to the UN Resolution 181 in 1947 that decided to divide that land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea into two states. And the way that it was described by the UN was a Jewish state and an Arab state. That's how UN Resolution 181 says. The Arab state was never formed. The Palestinians did not accept the resolution. Their territories were mostly occupied afterwards by Jordan, by Egypt. And in 1967, the war broke out between Israel, Jordan, and Egypt. And the result was that the total Palestinian area was occupied since then by Israel. In 1993, Israel signed an agreement with the representation of the Palestinian people to redivide the land. Okay, but unfortunately, that process was stopped. I'm not going to get into the history of that. And all that eventually led to the events of October 7th, when a massacre of Jewish settlers, we would call them, who live along the border with the Palestinian territories, were massacred by Hamas terrorists, which led to Israeli attacks on Gaza, which are still ongoing as we speak. So this is a very complex history, and this leads to a very complex identity of Israeli society. 73% of Israelis are Jews, and they belong to the Jewish nation. Okay, 21%, and that's a huge minority, belong to our Arabs. And we'll see in a few minutes, we will see how they see themselves and how they describe themselves. Then you look at this pie and you say, so who are the others, right? That's an interesting group. There's others as well in this mix. Well, the majority of those others are immigrants who came in since the 1990s, mostly from the former Soviet Union. While they are Jewish from the perspective of Israeli law, they're not Jewish from the perspective of Israeli religion. And so when the Central Bureau of Statistics, which is the source of this pie, describes them, it can't describe them as Jews, and of course that they're not Arabs either. So this shows you some of the complexity in the diversity within Israeli society. When you look at the makeup of the Arab population, it also is not uniform. Now, the majority, 84%, are Sunni Muslims. But within the Arab community, we also have not a small minority, 7% of them, which are about 2% of the total population, that are Christian, and they are divided to somewhere between 10 and 12 different Christian denominations and churches. It could be Catholic, Greek Orthodox, and so forth and so on. And within that, we have another group, which are the Druze. The Druze are Arabs, but they are not Muslim and they are not Christian. They have their own religion, and they don't necessarily identify themselves together with the Muslim population. In fact, most of them identify themselves with Israel and see themselves as Israelis. In general, in principle, the Druze serve in the Israeli military, which is more than anything else the sign of their feeling that they are part of Israeli society. Now, this national divide has definitely led to the systematic discrimination of the Arab minority over the 75 years of the Israeli state. It's nothing that one can deny. It is true. Jews and Arabs live separately in separate towns. This has to do, of course, with the historical making of the land. When Jews moved in, came in as immigrants, they did not move into Arab towns, but built their own towns. And so towns became separate, except for a few mixed cities. Of course, the most well-known of that is Jerusalem. But the Arab minority has been systematically discriminated against. It is underrepresented in the workplace in general and in academic jobs or jobs that require an academic degree in particular. It is underrepresented in management. It is underrepresented in government. Okay, so there is no question about this type of discrimination, and it is also a poorer society. In 2020, the average income of a Jewish family was double that of the average income of an Arab family. So clearly, this is not a situation that brings much pride to the Jewish majority. As I said, I'm a professor of communications. I study mostly communications, and when I look at these differences between the different groups in Israeli society, I look at it also through the prism of how they use communications and what kind of communications they have access to. So the latest numbers that we have, this is a study of the Israel Democracy Institute, the latest numbers that we have regarding how many, this is 2020, it's interesting, it's an interesting year, 2020, because, of course, because of COVID. Okay, during COVID, there was a rise in the use of computers and in general of digital communications because people, of course, were enclosed at home. So we can see that while the national average of using computers was in 2020 around 71% and is a little higher today, among Arabs, it was significantly low. And this has many reasons, one of them being the poor infrastructure in the Arab towns. As I explained before, country is divided. It's segregated, not legally, but segregated de facto between Jews and Arabs. And as a result, the Arab towns, which have been more neglected over the years as part of the systematic discrimination, have worse infrastructure, and as a result of that, less connectivity to computers. But as you can see, in 2020, as far as the daily use of the internet, it is exactly similar between Jews and Arabs. So the reason for that, I'm sure you all understand, is that more Arabs access the internet over their mobile phones. Mobile phone penetration is universal in Israel. It has been very high since the beginning of mobile phones in the 1990s. And this tells you another story, which is a story that because this community accesses the internet only over a phone and not over a computer, its access is not as robust and as rich as the ones that can access it through computers. But still, everybody does get to the internet, so which is an interesting phenomenon. Now, but what do the Israeli Arabs think about themselves? By the way, that's a good question, even by me asking it this way, because one of the things that I deal with, and if you ever happen to read anything I wrote, you'll find that many times when I refer to the Arab citizens of Israel, there's an asterisk, and I say, explain why in this particular paper I call them Arab Israelis. In another paper, I might call them Israeli Arabs. In a third paper, I might call them Palestinian Israelis or Palestinian citizens of Israel or just Palestinians. It all depends on the context of what we're trying to describe. But when these numbers are from 2022, from a study from the University of Haifa led, and Israeli Arabs were asked, what do you see yourself as? Okay, and the biggest group, the large, as you see, is less than 100% here. The largest group, okay, 42%, first and foremost, saw themselves as Arab. The second largest group, 24%, saw themselves as Muslim. And only third came in the identification as Palestinian. We are talking here about Arabs who live within the borders of Israel, not the borders of the post-1967, but the pre-1967 or 1948 borders. Okay, so this is an interesting phenomenon when we talk about identity. Still, when they were asked what is their second choice, another 25% described themselves as Palestinian. So that brings a larger number to the number of Arabs that see themselves as Palestinians. On another question that they were asked to say, are you a Palestinian from 1 to 100, or are you an Israeli on 1 to 100? And the numbers that you get from this study is that the score of Palestinian was 66, the score of Israeli was only 51. Now, following October 7th, and I don't think I have to explain what happened on October 7th, a poll was run in mid-November among Jews and Arabs in Israel. It was run by the Israeli Democracy Institute, questioning, do you feel a part of Israel and its challenges? This is a poll that's been running consecutively for more than 20 years. You can see the numbers in 2002. Only 53% of Israeli Arabs at the time felt that they were part of Israel, while 94% of Israeli Jews felt that way. 2002 was a very low point in the relationship between Jews and Arabs in Israel, because it was the height of what was known as the Second Intifada, the uprising of Palestinian Arabs, which started within the borders of Israel and what mostly took place in the occupied territories. So this was a bad time for the relations of Jews and Arabs. As you can see, over the years, this question fluctuated, but it reached its highest score, the highest level of identification of Israeli Arabs with the state of Israel happened after October 7th. This is a moment that is, at least when we think about it instinctively, one would think differently. But October 7th apparently was not a regular moment of conflict between Jews and Arabs as the ones we've known before. October 7th, Arabs were slaughtered as well. At least 24 Bedouin citizens were murdered on October 7th. There are a number of Bedouin citizens that are still held captive by the Hamas in Gaza. The Arab Israelis feel, as we can see from these numbers, for the first time and for more than any other time in the past 20-something years, that they are part of the state of Israel. It's a fascinating phenomenon. This poll, I have to be very careful about it, was taken in mid-November. It was already while Israel was bombing Gaza, while we knew the numbers of thousands of Palestinians being killed by Israeli Air Force and artillery. It is prior to the land invasion. So this number may have changed since. but the poll has not been run since. Still, it is a very interesting point of view of what October 7th has done to what Israeli Arabs feel about the state. I'd like to move on and talk about another one of the cleavages or rifts or challenges Israeli society faces daily, and that is the one of religiosity. I understand that many of, not the majority of my listeners are Jewish, so they know that Jewish life is very diverse, and there are many different types of ways to express your Judaism. That is true in Israel as well. Again, from far away, people look at it and think, all Jews, it's all Jews there. What are they fighting about? Well, it's kind of a little more complex than that. Only the majority of Israelis do not see themselves as religious at all. Now these numbers from the Central Bureau of Statistics, it's a little complex. I don't want to get into too many details. They've changed the way that they describe the different groups over the years. So we have two groups that are described as traditional now, clumped together. They used to be called the traditional religious group and the traditional non-religious. But in general, when we say traditional, we mean non-religious people. Okay, and therefore you can see that they carry certain traditions, but they do not follow necessarily religion and religious requirements. Only 10% of Israelis belong to what we call the ultra-Orthodox, and another 12% to what we call the Orthodox. We see the same type of question among the Arab community and the non-Jews. Again, the non-Jews, this refers, of course, also to those that belong to the other category when we looked at Israel. The majority, small majority, does not feel itself as religious, but almost half of the community does see itself as religious. In other words, the Arab society is far more religious than the Jewish society is, which is an interesting point of view. But we'll talk a little bit more about this question among the Jews. And then we'll talk about it again from my aspect, which I study, which is looking through how they use the internet. The ultra-Orthodox, and this again, 2020 is a watershed year because they had to start using the internet because it was their only way to access any type of information during the COVID lockdowns. Okay, so the percentage of Haredim or ultra-Orthodox Jews that had access to the internet went up from what it was 13 years before, 28% to 64%, but still it's much lower than the general Jewish population. And when you ask how they access the internet, you will see that the general Jewish population prefers to access the internet over its mobile phone, while the Haredi community prefers to access the internet over their computer because they feel probably that they have more control over the computer than over the mobile phone. Everyone in Israel, as you can see from the graph on the from the chart on the right, everybody in Israel has a mobile phone, whether they're Haredi or whether they are non-religious. Okay. However, as you can see, with the Haredi group, much less internet access. Okay, and while non-religious Israelis, secular Israelis, 97% of them use WhatsApp. Okay, and 98% of them are on some social network. Less than half of that is true within the religious community. The religious divide leads to also big social issues in Israel. They don't have to do only with religious belief. The ultra-Orthodox community is poor because many of the men do not work. They study and they expect their wives to make a living, but many of the women not allowed to work in mixed workplaces where they will be together with men, can only make a living with very low income type of living. Their educational standards are different than those of the non-religious community. Their schools don't teach what we call the core curriculum. which is basically with the two main elements of the core curriculum are math and English. They try to block their youth from studying these subjects because they don't want them to leave religiosity. Women in general are of a lower status within this community. They're not allowed to, as I said before, to mix in with where there are mixed crowds of men and women. And the basic big difference, unity and the majority Jewish community, is that the ultra-Orthodox community does not serve in the military. That has created a huge rift within Israeli society because among the Jews, they are seen as those that are not participating and not contributing to the national effort. And in Israel, a country that is in constant conflict, not serving in the military is of course a major issue. But October 7th brought about all kinds of repercussions regarding the relationship between the ultra-Orthodox community and between the non-religious community. This photograph you see on the left is one that I actually took. It's a photograph of a demonstration in New York City of ultra-Orthodox Jews that are demonstrating against Israel and for the Hamas. Which is an interesting point, which many of you may encounter if you come down to New York. But the role of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israeli society was put into a different light after October 7th. One was the major role of this organization called Zaka, which is an organization that identifies the dead, okay, and takes care of purification of bodies before burial. Okay, massacre of October 7th, with about 1,200 people murdered, some of them burnt down to the way that they could not be recognized. The fact that this group sees itself as dedicated to finding out the identity and identifying the dead endeared them to Israeli society very much. A few days after the war broke out, and a few days after the massacre, 2,000 ultra-Orthodox youth announced that they were going to volunteer for military service in the Israeli military. So that too was something that changed all of a sudden the feeling towards the state and the relationship between the ultra-Orthodox community and between the majority Jewish community. However, the ultra-Orthodox political parties have tried to maintain their political power. So we see here conflicting repercussions or conflicting moves happening as a result of October 7th. It seems like within the populace of the ultra-Orthodox community, there is a move to more integrate within general Israeli society. But their leadership, especially their political leadership, is trying to keep them out, again, to stay out of the Israeli center, or out of the Israeli non-religious life, by directing more and more funds to their educational system, which, as I said, does not adhere to the national core curriculum. Another question that arose was, how will soldiers get to their bases during the war? Because soldiers get a few hours off. Israel is a small country. When a soldier gets a few hours off, he usually goes home, takes a shower, eats something, and goes back to war. On the Sabbath, there is no public transportation. For the first 3 weeks of the war, for the first time in Israeli history, the train was working. However, that was immediately caught by the religious parties, and they stopped the running of the trains, creating another rift within Israeli society along the lines of religiosity and non-religiosity. The last group I would like to talk about or the last rift I want to talk about is the gender one. Questions of gender, of course, appear in different levels. They appear around religion, as I've mentioned. They appear around the national conflict. There are political questions that have to do with gender. There's, of course, economic issues and ethnic issues, and I'll try to cover some of them and also look at, again, the repercussions of October 7th to the status of women in Israeli society. In general, Israel has always been considered an extremely progressive country when it comes to the role of women in society and to their status in society. The Proclamation of Independence, read by David Ben-Gurion, who my university is named after, in May 14th, 1948, called for gender equality. By the way, it also called for equality with the Arab minority. It promised equality regardless of religion, race, or gender. One of the first laws the Israeli Knesset passed, the Israeli Parliament passed in 1951, was the law of the Equality of Women's Rights law. So that was a statement made by the state very early on that women are equal to men, something that, and of course, women in Israel were voting since day one, unlike some other countries that most of the people on this Zoom are are acquainted with. The women's labor law passed already in the early 1950s, promising, among other things, special rights for women who are pregnant and for young mothers. So a very progressive approach to women and women's rights. There was a law about requiring equal opportunity in employment. There was a law requiring equal pay for men and women in the workplace. Not always do these laws necessarily get applied, as we'll see in a few minutes. Also, the Israeli Supreme Court over the years has ruled in different ways to raise the level of equality between men and women, because it was required to interfere in this cleavage, in this fracture between men and women in the community. One famous decision, the Shakdiel decision in the late 1980s, forced what are known as religious affairs councils to have women sit on them, because religious affairs councils were comprised only of men. Supreme Court forced them to have women sit on them. Similar, that was in the city of Yerucham, a small town not far from Beersheba, where Ben-Gurion University is. Similar issue came up in Tel Aviv, which today is seen as this bastion of liberalism. But in the late 80s, only men were allowed to elect the members of the Religious Affairs Municipal Council, and the court forced the mayor of Tel Aviv at the time, a very liberal man, to have women on that voting block as well. The Alice Miller is one of the most famous and relevant to our day decisions of the Israeli court, where the court forced the Israeli army, the IDF, to allow women to serve as pilots. Following that decision, more and more women have been allowed to do more and more things in the army, including combat. Even our own daughter was a combat soldier in the Israeli military when she was a little younger. And another famous case in the 1990s, the case of Danilovich, recognized the rights of gay couples many, many years before this was accepted in other Western countries. Even though they still cannot get married in Israel, but I don't want to get into that particular conflict. That can come up maybe later in the questions. However, with all of this liberal background, women are still have not reached full equality in Israeli society. One example is, again, in the Jewish religious community. On your left, you see a photo of defaced women on an advertisement in a religious town in Bnei Brak. Okay, The locals don't like to see pictures of women, and so they sprayed their faces. On the right, you see a story of girls that were asked to sit in the back of the bus. That also, I'm sure, reminds Americans of many things. So women have been fighting for their position within the Israeli public sphere over the years. And these two photos that I've given you are from the last year. Okay, this is an issue that has been ongoing, especially with regards to the relationship between secular women and religious men. And some of you who have flown maybe to Israel have seen scenes of that sort on flights where men refuse to sit next to women and ask them to move to another seat. There is also very high inequality in Israeli politics. Everybody talks about Golda Meir and that she was the first prime minister, a woman prime minister, one of the first in the whole world. But people tend to forget that she was the only woman in the Israeli government for its first 25 years. Eventually, she became prime minister. But if you look at the representation in the Israeli parliament, it has been the representation of women was growing for a while, but has again dropped in the last election with the rise of the religious parties and the right-wing parties and the big loss of the left. And we're back now to numbers that take us back 5 election cycles to the number of women, which was much higher already 10 years ago. So there's an issue that still needs to be resolved. When you look at the members of the Israeli cabinet, you can see too that the number of women is very low and has gone significantly down again within the last government. Again, people talk about liberalization, people talk about different years. In the years of Menachem Begin as prime minister, 6 years he was prime minister, there was not even one woman in his government in the late 70s, early 1980s. By the way, an exception to this rule is the Israeli Supreme Court, where women have been sitting since the late 1970s, and we have already had 3 chief justices of the Supreme Court, women in Israel's history. It has explanations. Maybe I can get to that in the Q&A later on. There's also I'm not going to hide that there's huge inequality in Israeli academia, where I come from. What you see here is the percentage of senior faculty members in the 9 Israeli research universities. And as you can see, the number of men or the ratio of men is double the ratio of women in these positions. And the closing of this gap is extremely, extremely slow. There is still high inequality in pay in Israeli society, and it's actually growing. Okay, this is the average monthly salary. Okay, between this is 2021. It's not 2001. It's a mistake in the slide. In the past for 15 years, and you can see that the difference is only growing in favor of men as the years go by. So again, we are having an issue here. However, October 7th again brought about the question of rights or equality of women, and in a very strong way, because we found out that women actually were the ones that took part in the fighting in a way that was never seen before. We have women in tanks. They were among the first to jump and the first to be active on October 7th and to block the terrorists. We know that the special group of what we call watchers have been for months, if not for years, saying that this attack on Israel is imminent. Their commanders, who were men, did not listen to them, and the role of women, therefore, has been brought up again as one that should be bigger when it comes also to the military. The same comes as to the intelligence and the way that it was analyzed before the war. Again, it turns out that there were women that were stating that something big is about to happen, and the men did not listen to them. However, when you look at the cabinet, what we call the special war cabinet, it has only men sitting in it, even though we know that the role of women has been crucial, both in fighting back the terrorists on October 7th and in warning of this this might happen. I will most quickly just state that there are other rifts that I did not get to talk about. The one between rich and poor in Israel is the worst inequality among rich and poor in the world, second only to the United States. We have the rifts between immigrants and old timers, the immigrants, especially with questions of immigrants from Ethiopia and Russian immigrants, questions of religion. Of course, there was the Israel-Palestine war. There were the big demonstrations in 2011. There was a lot going on in Israeli society. For the past year, Israeli society has undergone another huge crisis, a political crisis. The government that was elected exactly a year ago tried to overhaul the judicial system. And as a result, for 39 consecutive weeks, hundreds of thousands of Israelis stormed to the streets in order to demonstrate against that. They were able to block most of that legislation, and those demonstrations were stopped only because of the massacre of October 7th that changed the mood, of course, and made it impossible to demonstrate. However, the demonstrators and the organizations that they created became the central support movement for the military effort and for help to the evacuees from the communities that were affected. Has there ever been any solidarity in Israeli society is a good question. Studies that I was involved with my colleague Akiva Cohen and my colleague Daphne Lemish over the years, looking at how people use telephones, indicated to us that solidarity in Israeli society has mostly been a myth. What these numbers show you is that when something happens, some kind of crisis happens, the people that are close by to where it happens are highly involved. The people that are far away, they don't necessarily bother to call. So at least as far as their telephone behavior, we've written years ago that we don't really believe that solidarity is high in Israeli society. Is October 7th a turning point? This is a photograph of one of the help centers created by the former protest movement that became the movement for support of the soldiers. Is it a turning point? Are Israelis ready to overcome these rifts and cleavages and try to, with the relations as we saw between Jews and Arabs, with how we're treating women, with the way that the religious community wants to feel part of society? Are we about to see a turning point? That's a question that I would leave open, and I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm open now to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for such an engaging and nuanced presentation. I know I learned much from it, and in particular, I wasn't aware of the number of Israeli Arabs who identify with the state of Israel after October 7th. So that was surprising to me. And to get us, well, everyone, please go ahead and submit more questions. We will continue with this portion now. Someone asked a question on your graph about Israeli Arabs identifying with the state of Israel. There was a dip, I believe, around 2014. And someone was asking what if you know what happened during that time that was a challenging part of Israel's history.
2014, I would assume that it's connected to the war that was called Protective Edge? Tzuk-Eitan, it was called in Hebrew. I don't remember what the English name to it was. It was it was the previous more violent conflict with Gaza, including an Israeli land incursion into Gaza. It was not provoked by a massacre of the type of, or anything like what we saw this year. And I assume that at that time, the Israeli Arabs did not see that it was justified and did not create an identification with the state. But this is just, I did not do that study, so it's just my assumption as to why these numbers are like that.
Thank you. I believe I see a follow-up here by Art. Are the groups you described equal in their support of the war? Not the war itself, but the way it is being conducted. If not, how do the groups differ? So,
Well, I don't have numbers for that. I would say what I would say now would totally be from looking at Israeli media and from my impressions from being on the ground. I just came into the US from Israel just 3 days ago. I was there all last week. The majority of Israelis, from what I've seen in recent polls, support the Israeli war effort. I would say that an overwhelming majority of Israeli support. That's also what the polls show in recent days. I wouldn't, it would be hard to say how that is differentiated among these different groups that I described because I did not see any studies that differentiates among them. One of the issues that came up in the 2 months since the war started was the question of allowing demonstrations to take place either for or against the war. The police has been blocking from demonstrations from taking place in Arab communities, fearing that that might lead to violence, even though, as the chief of police had mentioned in one of the Knesset committees, we have seen no signs of any attempted uprising within the Arab community. Actually, totally to the contrary. So we haven't seen. So if there is opposition among the Israeli Arab community to the war, it did not. I see that I disappeared. Okay. It
I
did
still
not.
see you.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want me to stop the share screen?
I think it just stopped on my screen.
Oh, okay. But anyway, so we don't know of that. But that it's definitely, I'm certain that within the Arab community there is, if there is a community that is opposed to the war, it would be higher within the Arab community. There was a small demonstration in Tel Aviv 3 weeks ago. A few hundred people who demonstrated against the war.
Thanks. There's a number of follow-up questions that I've seen come in. So the first one here is, have the Israeli Arabs been public in their support for the war?
I mean, in what way? They are Israeli Arabs. Many Israeli Arabs are public in their support for the, I would call, for the war effort. For example, the city of Rahat, which is a Bedouin city, the second largest Arab city in Israel, which is located about, I would say, 10 miles from the Gaza or 12 miles from the Gaza border, and which has also suffered rockets, and some of its citizens were murdered, has one of the centers for support for the military effort, which is run by the locals. So that is an example of the type of support that Arabs take part in. Beyond that, vocal support, it's hard. I can't, nothing that I can point out to that comes up to mind immediately.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a few questions here that are asking about discrimination against Arab Israelis, and what's that attributed to, given, this person wrote, given that the Declaration of Independence wording. Another person asked about whether or not it is reflective in them not serving in the military. if you have any thoughts on that.
Okay, so, well, Israel does not recruit Israeli Arabs to the military. It does not want to put them in conflict because they will be fighting their brothers on the other side of the border. However, Israeli Arabs that want to join the army can, and there has been a rise in the number joining the Israeli military, but this is pre-October 7th, okay? I think I saw last year a number of about 2,000 Israeli Arabs who have volunteered to serve in the Israeli military. Mostly, they would be Christian Arabs. If they serve in the military, of course, they are eligible for all the benefits that reservists get when they finish their military service. The question of how come the Arab minority could have been discriminated against, even though the Proclamation of Independence promises them equality, is a question that I've been dealing with for my whole career and trying to fight that. It's a wrong, it's an injustice. It shouldn't be happening. We know that in many countries, including some that most of the participants in this event are acquainted with, even though there were laws that promised equality and civil rights to all. There has been discrimination against certain groups based on, for example, on race. So it's not something that does not happen in other countries where the law is one thing and where the actual actions are different.
Great, thank you. We can come back to the Arab Israelis. I see there's more questions, but on a different group of minorities, there's a question here about the Vietnamese and Thais who live in Israel, and this person's asking if are they citizens? Like what is their role in society? If you want to speak to that.
Okay, so I assume that this question arises because of the Thais that were released, that were held as hostages and released, and therefore got some publicity in the media. No, you cannot become a citizen of Israel if you are not part of the Jewish nation. Israel does not have immigration laws. It only has a repatriation law. Okay, that's a distinction. But as I explained in the beginning, and I'll get to the Thais in a second, as I explained in the beginning, there is a difference between looking at Jews as a religion and looking at Jews as a nation. Those that are eligible to immigrate to Israel, to repatriate into Israel because they are Jewish, are not necessarily recognized as Jews by the religious authorities. Okay, they are Jews nationally, they are not necessarily Jews religiously. That being said, none of the Thais or Vietnamese that people were exposed to in these things are Israeli citizens. There is a very large constituency in Israel of migrant workers, especially working in three fields, I would say, in agriculture, in construction, and in care for the elderly. The majority of the agricultural workers are Thai. Construction workers, many come from China. Others come from Eastern European countries. The caregivers come from Asian countries. They're Thai, Filipino, Indian. Vietnamese is less common. There is a very small Vietnamese community that emerged from the bringing in of a Vietnamese ship of refugees in the late 1970s following the war in Vietnam. One of the first moves of Menachem Begin when he was prime minister was to save this particular ship that was sinking and no country was willing to accept those refugees. There were, I think, 67 of them that were brought to Israel, and there was a very small Vietnamese community that emerged out of that group in the northern town of Afula. So if you want good Vietnamese food, that's the place to go get it.
Thank you. Yeah, there was you answered several questions in one there, so I appreciate that. There was somebody else who had asked about the Russian immigrants and what the difference was between the state of Israel's Jewish standards versus the religious community. So you mentioned, I think you mentioned at one point how gay couples cannot get married, and so there's I think I noticed a question about that. There's also somebody who asked about interfaith relationships in Israel, and if you want to speak toward that, that relationship in the country.
Sure. So, as one of the inheritances of the British colonialist times is that in Israel, you can only get married according to religious law. This is true both for Jews and for non-Jews. In other words, a Muslim cannot marry a non-Muslim, and a Jew cannot marry a non-Jew. And in some communities, such as in the Jewish community anyway, they prefer to marry among themselves. But there is no official way for intermarriage in Israel, and there is no civil marriage in Israel. So there is also no gay marriage in Israel. However, this is not exactly the topic of this talk, but being a lawyer, I can explain that one. As a result of what is known as private international law standards, every country has to recognize a status that has been achieved in another country. So if a gay couple gets married in the US and they're recognized as married in the US, Israel has to recognize them as married. And so you have married gay couples in Israel and you have interfaith marriages in Israel, but all of those weddings took place outside the country and were recognized by Israel because another country has recognized them.
Thank you. Yes. And yeah, it's an interesting thing. I know, a lot of people have to go to Cyprus or somewhere else to get married. But
Yes, that's a whole business. You
yeah.
can buy a weekend in Cyprus, including the city hall that does the wedding for you, and the food and the catering and everything, and the hotel. Go on Friday, get married, come back on Sunday, and you're a married couple. And it's a couple $100.
Yeah, sounds good. The as a follow-up, this is a big question that's happening here in the United States, has to do with transgender girls and women and being able to play female sports. I don't know if that's a question that they're asking yet in Israel, or if you're aware of that conversation.
That particular question has not come up in Israel. The most famous case in Israel has to do with a transgender referee in the Israeli National Soccer League, and she is um, uh, accepted by all and has become a national figure that is very well accepted. Again, one of the paradoxes I did not have time, of course, to talk about in the 45 minutes I allotted to this talk is that Israel is a very progressive society when it comes to the recognition of gay rights. I mentioned the Danilovich case, but also the medical interference that is required for transgender changes is part of what is covered by the national medical insurance, and is also provided. One of the cases that the Civil Rights Association that I'm involved with had to do is also provided to prisoners who are undergoing a gender change. So Israel definitely recognizes this as a need, as a medical need that needs to be supported by the state.
Thank you. Yeah, it's nice. Israel, as you said, has always been very progressive. So it's really a wonderful thing. Going back to the relationship between Israelis and Arabs, It says that we know there has been a lot of unrest in the West Bank. Do you know how Israelis in general feel about the recent events there? And then it goes on, there have been a significant number of reservists who had objected to various positions the government was taken and who said they would not agree to all call-ups. Has this had any effect? I guess there's two questions there on October 7th.
The West Bank question, I think that there are very bad things happening in the West Bank these days. The Israeli media is not covering them enough, and so the Israeli public is not aware of them enough. Also, I would say the Israeli public opinion in general is still in shock following October 7th, and I'm not sure has the capability at this point to see other injustices that are being done in its name. And I think that that actually is being used by those that are looking to flare things up in the West Bank as well, knowing that they're kind of, away from the limelights. The second question had to do with the reservists. In fact, that's as I was explaining, things turned around. The first ones to show up for reserve duty were those that said that they would not serve under this government. Not only did they show up for reserve duty, they are also the ones running the civic effort. They turned their logistics centers for protests into logistical centers providing food and support and equipment and housing, both for the military and for the evacuees. While it is a common belief that the thought of Hamas was that Israel is vulnerable because of its internal conflict around the political issue, and especially this question of whether people would serve or not, they were proven wrong. The failure was the hugest, the largest failure in the history of the state and maybe in the history of any Western state since World War II, as far as intelligence and military response. But the civil response of the reservists was commendable and immediate. Some of the leaders of the resistance to the judicial overhaul were the first ones to be out there saving people on October 7th.
Thank you. Yes. And how do the there's Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank and in Gaza, and then Israeli Arabs. How do they still identify themselves all sort of with, you mentioned in your thing how they all prior to the war sort of all began to identify as Palestinians. Do they all still feel the same connection to each other? Does that?
Well, like as I mentioned, Israeli Arabs or Palestinians that are citizens of Israel do not, the majority, this has been in polls for years, do not want to see themselves as citizens of a Palestinian state. They prefer to stay citizens of Israel. There are a number of areas adjacent to the West Bank along the border with Israel, and there's been discussion of having land swaps between this future Palestinian entity and Israel, where these Arab communities will become part of the Palestinian state, and the citizens of those towns reject any notion of that sort. They have been Israeli citizens for 75 years. They pay taxes in Israel. They paid the Social Security in Israel, and they expect to get everything as equal citizens, what they deserve. They're not to be transferred from side to side. Clearly, among the Arab Israeli community, there is higher identification with a quest of Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza for independence. And they have representation in the Knesset that brings that up. But if you look at the representation in the Knesset, it's an interesting statistic. What are known as the Arab parties, their political power is only about half the power or the ratio of Arabs within Israeli society, which means that about 50% of Israeli Arabs vote for parties that do not identify the Arab cause as their main cause. And that means, again, it's part of the process of their Israelization, okay, their higher identification with the state of Israel. And as we said, I mean, as the topic of this talk hints at, it seems to be also one of the repercussions of the massacre on October 7th and the war.
Thank you. And there's a number of questions around what the Israeli public sees from the media, as far as showing photos of what's happening in Gaza, and the number of casualties and the destruction of different water and food. Some different people have mentioned do they see similar media that the rest of the world is seeing?
The answer is no. The behavior of the Israeli media in this sense is shameful. Israelis are not exposed to the destruction in Gaza, definitely not the same way that the world sees it. And it's one of the reasons why Israelis don't understand a lot of the demonstrations against Israel, because they're not open to these scenes that other people around the world see. Israeli media is extremely, in these days, as it usually is during times of war, and as American media is, as we know, after 9/11 and during the Gulf War and so forth. It hides from its own people the destruction that its own army is creating on the other side, and it's because patriotism sells. It's easier to sell advertisement when you're patriotic.
Thank you. Yeah, there were probably 5 or 6 people who were asking about that question at least. There's a couple of questions that have been asked, and I think maybe it's important for you to clarify some of Israel history about how Arab Israelis are citizens, and how are they citizens versus Palestinians, or people who live in West Bank and in Gaza.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't have a slide with maps, but I'll try to explain that very briefly. When the UN passed the partition plan in 1947, the plan was mostly along the lines of where there were large concentrations of Jews and Arabs. And so the 2 states were supposed to be one for the Jews, one for the Arabs. The borders were realigned and the war ended. Some of the areas that had a majority of Arabs, including mostly the north, became part of sovereign Israel, which is internationally recognized as such. And so a large minority, as I said, 21% today, of the citizens of Israel are Arabs that, following the 1948 war, stayed within the borders of Israel. Now, the larger part of the areas that were designated for the Arab state in 1947 were occupied between 1948 and 1967 by Jordan and by Egypt. The West Bank by Jordan and the Gaza Strip by Egypt. In 1967, Israel occupied these areas from Jordan and from Egypt, but it never annexed them to Israel. And so the Palestinians that live in these territories did not get Israeli citizenship, as the Palestinians who live within the borders of Israel that were recognized as the armistice lines in 1948. So all the Arabs that are within the borders of Israel post 1948, okay, are Israeli citizens with full equal rights. They vote, they get Social Security, They get health. We have nationalized health in Israel. They get education and so forth. Okay, but those that are in the territories that were designated for the Arab state in 1947, okay, and that after the 1948 war were not occupied by Israel, okay, but by Jordan and Egypt, they remain non-citizens of Israel. Within, as I mentioned briefly in the beginning, the Oslo Accords in 1993, Israel and the representation of the Palestinian people, at the time it was the Palestinian Liberation Organization, signed an agreement that gave a certain level of autonomy to those Arabs living in Gaza and in the West Bank. That's how we came about with Hamas, because Israel has not been controlling that area since the Oslo Accords of 1993. It has been under Palestinian self-rule. They don't have an independent state, but they have self-rule on all civil matters. They have their own police, they have their own hospitals, their own other government services. But they're not part of Israel. Israel does not occupy those areas that have been put under Palestinian rule following the 1993 Oslo Accords. I hope I explained this well, because it's a very complex history to explain in 5 sentences.
No, I appreciate it. I think you did. And if if anybody has further questions on it, you can shoot us an email and we can send you in the right direction or help answer your questions. There were a number of questions that I wanted to make sure that was a clear, as best as we can do in a short period. It was a clear statement. We're running out of time, and there's many questions. One question here that I don't know if it's been spoken to too much is the differences in Israeli society between Sephardi and Ashkenazi and Mizrahi. If there's anything you want to speak toward.
It's well, these are different Jewish groups with different traditions. They are all, of course, equal citizens of the state. I think that there is a majority of Israelis are of European or Russian descent, and a little smaller minority comes from Mizrahi descent, which means from North Africa or Middle Eastern countries, Iraq and Morocco most being the 2 largest ones. The differences are in the traditions, but the differences are also political. The Jews came from the Arab countries, from North Africa and Middle Eastern countries, were the ones that were absorbed by Jews that came from Europe already in the 1930s and 1940s. As such, they were originally discriminated against and have felt the repercussions of that discrimination to this very day. Some people are using it politically in order to advance political agendas. That you could say that from a legal point of view, these are groups that are totally equal, because historically the Jews that came from North Africa and Middle Eastern countries had a harder beginning when they came in the 1950s and 60s. Many are still catching up, but if you look at the makeup today of Israeli parliament, Israeli cabinet, the leadership of banks and large corporations and so forth, and especially because Jews get married, they don't today it's very hard to differentiate a couple that gets married where they came from. If one, the mother and the father, one is Ashkenazi and one is Mizrahi, and so forth and so on. I think that those differences are slowly disappearing, but there are remnants of that discrimination of the 1950s and 60s. And there are politicians who tried to, and that succeed in using that as a tool for their personal advancement.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's an important part of history of where, where the Israeli citizens, where they came from, and then, so the relationship to the, whether it's the Middle East or Europe, is part of the narrative that you also don't hear as often. And
yeah, and by the way, and also in those, when I was showing the makeup of Israeli society, those that consider themselves traditional are mostly Jews that come from Middle Eastern and North African countries. It's usually traditional and Mizrahi goes together in those polls that where people have to identify themselves and their religiosity. So the Mizrahi community is more traditional in its observance in general, of its observance of Jewish traditions than the Ashkenazi European community.
thank you. As sort of a final question, I feel like I don't want to let it go just because there's so many people have asked about it, about the coalition, of the right and the opposition and the protests that were happening, and sort of, the Orthodox versus non-Orthodox Jews. Is any of that going to move forward with the Supreme Court issues being addressed in those hostilities, or is it something that will conclude once we're at a different place?
Well, we say in Israel that since the destruction of the temple, the prophecy has been given to the fools. So I'm not going to make any predictions about what will happen in the future. I can only say what I can see now. As I mentioned, of course, October 7th stopped all protests, but we can see a resurgence of the protests recently. We can see that there are factions within the government that are trying to restart some elements of the judicial overhaul that was planned then. It's only the beginnings. It's hard to see where it's going. There is currently an emergency government that was formed on the week of following October 7th, and one of the agreements of that government was that no legislation that does not have to do with the war effort will pass. So far, none of those laws that were envisioned by the coalition has been promoted in any way. But it's very hard to say where Israeli politics is going now and whether that will come back. And I'm really, really reluctant in making any predictions at this point.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. And now that we're coming to a conclusion, if there's any final thoughts that you want to leave us with for the
well, just I'm really flattered that so many people have shown up to hear this. I think that when we deal with complex issues, we should dive into them and try to understand their complexities. Living in America this year, on behalf of the university, but I'm here, I've noticed that a lot of the public debate here is based in ignorance, and ignorance brings hate. And I hope that there will be many opportunities for Americans, not just those that come to events of the Haberman Institute, but Americans in general will be willing to learn more about the issues and about their complexity, and not see things in black and white as some people do.